Today, we'll be looking into 4 horrifying caving tragedies, where explorers ventured too deep and never made it back. Some were trapped for hours, others for weeks, but all of them met a fate more terrifying than you could ever imagine. And the first story? It's especially disturbing, not just because of how he died, but because his body is still there to this day. The night air was cold outside Peak Cavern in Castleton, Derbyshire, England, known grimly as the Devil's Arse by the locals. It was March 22nd, 1959, and a group of young explorers stood at the cave's yawning entrance, their lanterns casting flickering beams against the jagged rock. Among them was Neil Moss, a 20-year-old Oxford student, bright, ambitious, and drawn to the unknown. Neil wasn't an amateur. He had experience navigating caves, and he carried the quiet confidence of a man who had always been able to push just a little further than others. But tonight, that confidence would be his undoing. The group was not embarking on a routine exploration. Their goal was ambitious, to push beyond the known limits of Peak Cavern's labyrinthine depths. This system, buried beneath Derbyshire, was ancient, its passageways twisting through the earth like veins. Some led to grand, cathedral-like chambers, while others tightened into suffocating crawl spaces where a single wrong movement could spell disaster. And at the farthest reach of their known path was a passage called the Cheese Press. An 18-inch wide fissure, it was barely large enough for a human body to squeeze through. Even experienced cavers hesitated before attempting it. Once inside, you had to keep moving forward because there was no space to turn around. But Neil was determined. As he crouched at the mouth of the passage, his breath condensed in the cold air. Behind him, his fellow cavers exchanged nervous glances. They knew the risks, but Neil was already inching forward. He exhaled, compressing his chest, and slid into the abyss. At first, the passage was manageable. Neil inched forward, pushing with his feet, his arms pinned against his sides. The damp, mineral-rich scent of the cave filled his nostrils, the rock walls pressing in from all sides. He could hear the muffled voices of his team behind him, their words distorted by the rock. But then, the tunnel narrowed. His breathing grew more labored as the walls constricted. He tried shifting his position, but with every movement, the jagged limestone seemed to tighten its grip. He was now completely vertical, his body angled downward. The pressure against his chest was immense. He exhaled deeply to shrink his torso and moved an inch forward. But the moment he inhaled again, he realized his mistake. His chest expanded, and the rock wouldn't let go. At first, he remained calm. He had been in tight spaces before. He had to stay still, control his breathing, and wait for his team to help. But as minutes passed, the weight of the situation sank in. His lower body was still free, but his torso was wedged like a cork in a bottle. He tried to move his arms. Nothing. He could barely turn his head. The limestone was holding him prisoner. A bead of sweat ran down his forehead, cooling instantly in the cave's near-freezing air. "Neil," someone called from behind. Their voice was tinged with uncertainty. "I'm stuck," he finally admitted. His voice sounded far away, swallowed by the stone. There was silence before the frantic scramble of movement as his teammates tried to help. One of them, a more experienced caver, maneuvered into the passage behind him, grabbing at his legs in an attempt to pull him back. But Neil didn't budge. If anything, the pressure grew worse. His breathing became shallow. Each inhale took more effort. His ribs strained against the unyielding stone. He was slowly, agonizingly suffocating, not because there wasn't enough air, but because his own body had become a cage within the rock. And then, a terrifying realization hit him. He was too deep in. Word spread fast. By the time rescuers arrived, hours had passed. Some of Britain's most skilled cave divers and miners were summoned, bringing tools, ropes, and desperate determination. But the reality was grim. Neil was wedged too tightly to be pulled out by hand. Chiseling the rock was considered, but one wrong move, and the vibration alone could send fragments collapsing onto him. They tried looping a rope around his legs to pull him free. The first attempt failed. The friction of the narrow tunnel worked against them. The second attempt was worse. The force of the pull caused Neil to shift, but instead of freeing him, it wedged him even deeper. And that was when the rescuers noticed something even more terrifying. The oxygen levels were dropping. The narrow passage trapped exhaled air, and with every breath, Neil was slowly poisoning himself with his own carbon dioxide. As the rescue attempts grew more frantic, he could feel the change in his body. His muscles were weakening, his mind clouding. The voices above him blurred together, like echoes in a dream. He wasn't just stuck, he was slowly suffocating. His breaths became shallower. Each inhale burned his throat. The voices of the rescuers faded, and then, slowly, everything went silent. When the rescuers finally confirmed Neil was gone, a grim decision had to be made. There was no way to remove his body without risking more lives. So they made a choice, one that would haunt cavers for generations. They sealed the passage with concrete. Neil Moss remains there to this day, his body entombed in a section in Peak Cavern known as the Moss Chamber, forever part of the rock that had crushed him. A kind of cautionary tale, a warning, and a reminder that in the depths of the earth, nature always wins. Neil's death shook the caving world, especially with the media attention it garnered. His entombment was a grim necessity, a decision that led to stricter safety measures in British cave exploration. To this day, no one ventures past that point in Peak Cavern. The entrance to the cheese press remains sealed, a silent marker of the horror that unfolded there. Caving tragedies don't just disappear, they linger, whispered among explorers, warnings etched into the walls of the underground. Neil Moss's fate was a lesson, a reminder that the Earth is indifferent to human struggle. But 20 years later, across the Atlantic, another man would push too far, too deep, into a place that would become his tomb. This is the story of Ken DeVore, an experienced caver who ventured alone into the unmapped depths of the Panamint Range caves in California. His confidence, his skill, his determination, none of it mattered when the mountain decided it wouldn't let him go. Because when Ken slid into a passage known as the Vice, he didn't know it yet, but he had already made his last descent. Ken DeVore wasn't reckless. He was a veteran explorer, a man who had spent decades navigating the twisting arteries of the earth. He understood the dangers better than most, but he also understood the thrill. In 1980, he set his sights on an uncharted cave system deep within the Panamint Range, a treacherous remote stretch of land where few dared to tread. These mountains had a history of swallowing men, stories of prospectors disappearing in the 1800s, of bodies never recovered. But Ken wasn't superstitious. Armed with nothing but his gear and his instincts, he entered the darkness alone. From the moment he stepped inside, he knew this cave was different. The air was dry, carrying the scent of ancient dust. The walls, jagged and unyielding, whispered of passageways untouched by human hands. His flashlight cast long, dancing shadows, illuminating tunnels that stretched in every direction. Ken moved carefully, cataloging his route. He didn't want to get lost, but as he delved deeper, the passageways became narrower, the rock pressing in from all sides. He had been in tight spaces before. It didn't faze him. Then, he found it. A vertical crevice barely wide enough for a human body. It was the Vice. A brutal, unforgiving crack in the rock, so narrow that once you entered, there was no turning back. You could only go down. Ken hesitated. Even he could feel the danger here. But the desire to push forward, to conquer the unknown, overpowered his fear. Taking a deep breath, he wedged himself into the crevice and began to descend. At first, he moved with careful precision. His boots braced against the rough walls, his hands gripping for stability. The passage was tight, but he had navigated worse. But as he descended into the cave, he could notice the walls getting narrower and starting to squeeze in on him. His ribs scraped against the limestone. His arms were pinned tighter to his sides. He exhaled, shrinking himself, sliding a few inches further. The rock seemed to wrap around him like a fist closing around prey. Then he inhaled, and nothing moved. His chest expanded, and the walls refused to let him breathe. Panic flashed through his mind. He tried to shift, to force himself downward, but the rock only tightened its grip. There was no denying it. He was stuck, trapped in an unmapped, unexplored cave, alone. The first hour was spent in controlled panic. He tried everything, exhaling to shrink his chest, flexing his legs for leverage. But the more he struggled, the deeper the vice squeezed him tightly. Soon his breathing became a battle. Every inhale fought against the rock. Every exhale stole another inch of movement, until he could barely fill his lungs at all. Then, dehydration set in. Caves are mercilessly dry, draining the body's moisture. Ken hadn't planned for an extended stay, and now he was stuck in a stone coffin, his body demanding water that he couldn't provide. His throat burned, his lips cracked, his pulse pounded in his skull, each beat a countdown to oblivion. And then, the worst part. He was still completely conscious, and worst of all, he had ventured into the cave alone. When Ken failed to return, search teams were soon called in. They followed his route, retracing his steps until they found the entrance to the vice. The moment they saw how tight the passage was, dread filled the air. They called his name to make sure he was still alive. What they got was a faint, hoarse sound echoed back. He was still alive, but the rescuers knew immediately that the situation was bad. But still, they tried everything. One rescuer crawled in, carefully trying to reach Ken's legs. He gripped his boots, pulled with all his strength, but Ken didn't budge. The passage he had forced himself into was too narrow. They tried using chisels, chipping away at the rock, but each strike sent tremors through the stone, and with every vibration, the cave threatened to collapse. The more they fought to save him, the more hopeless it became. And Ken? He was fading. By now he could barely breathe. The weight of the rock crushed his chest, his ribs straining to expand. His vision blurred, his thoughts fragmented. He had been in here for over 24 hours now. At this point, he could barely breathe, and everything was slowly turning black. Despite the valiant efforts of the rescuers, Ken DeVore was gone, buried beneath the mountain. The rescuers made a grim decision. The cave was too unstable. To retrieve his body would risk another life. So, like Neil Moss before him, Ken was left where he died. The entrance to the vice was sealed to prevent over-adventurous cavers like Ken from venturing in again and meeting the same deadly fate. To this day, Ken's remains are still there, deep within the Panamint range, a permanent reminder of what happens when the earth decides not to let you go. Ken DeVore's final breaths were stolen by the crushing grip of the vice, just as Neil Moss was suffocated by the unyielding walls of the cheese press. The earth doesn't forgive, and it doesn't bargain. But while Ken and Neil died alone in the silent depths, Floyd Collins' fate was different. His struggle wasn't just his own. It became a spectacle, a national obsession. For 17 days, the world watched as he fought to stay alive, pinned beneath the Kentucky soil. And in the end, his tomb would become something far more grotesque than a simple grave. This is the story of Floyd Collins, the man who turned into a legend trapped in the darkness. Floyd Collins wasn't just any caver. He was a cave hunter. Born in 1887, he grew up in the caves of Kentucky's Mammoth Cave System, one of the largest and most complex underground networks in the world. While most people feared the dark, Floyd embraced it. He had spent his life crawling through tunnels barely wider than his body, chasing the thrill of adventure and discovery. But for Floyd, caving actually more than the excitement and adventure, it was opportunity. In the 1920s, the caves of Kentucky were big business. Tourists traveled from all over to see the underground wonders, and Floyd believed he could find a new entrance to Mammoth Cave, one that would make him rich. So, in January 1925, armed with nothing but a kerosene lantern and sheer determination, he descended into a remote cavern called Sand Cave, hoping to find a new way into the legendary system. Instead, he found death waiting for him. Sand Cave was treacherous. Its tunnels were unstable, the rock soft and prone to collapse. But Floyd pushed deeper, crawling on his stomach through a passage so tight that he had to exhale just to squeeze forward. Then, it happened. As he slithered through a particularly narrow gap, his lantern flickered, the walls trembled. Before he could react, a 27-pound slab of limestone broke loose and crashed down onto his left leg, pinning his ankle beneath half a ton of rock. Floyd screamed, his voice swallowed by the blackness. He thrashed, clawed at the stone, but it wouldn't budge. His arms were free, but that meant nothing. He was trapped, alone, and deep underground. The air was cold with the darkness surrounding him completely. And the worst part, no one knew where he was. However, outside the cave, his brother and family had become worried when he didn't return. His brother, Homer Collins, motivated some people, and they came looking for him. When Floyd heard his brother's voice calling for him in the cave, relief flooded through him. He was going to be saved, but the moment the rescuers saw the situation, that hope began to fade. The tunnel leading to Floyd was too tight. There was no way to pull him out, not without risking a full collapse. Still, the rescuers tried everything. They dug at the stone with bare hands. They brought in chisels and picks, but every strike of the hammer sent tremors through the unstable passage. The only thing they could do was keep Floyd alive while they tried to figure out the next move. They sent food and water down to him, lowering it in tin buckets. They brought a light bulb down to provide a little warmth in the frozen tomb, but they still couldn't figure out how to move the rock that had him pinned down. And time was running out. Word spread like wildfire. Soon, the small town of Cave City, Kentucky became the center of a national media frenzy. Newspapers printed hourly updates about Floyd's ordeal. Thousands of people arrived at the cave, turning the desperate rescue into a spectacle. Reporters camped outside, desperate for the latest development. Vendors even set up food stands, turning the tragedy into something grotesquely carnival-like. Even the government got involved. The Kentucky National Guard arrived, bringing in engineers and miners to dig a full-scale rescue shaft. But days kept passing, and deep below the earth, Floyd was starting to fade. By day 10, Floyd's body was shutting down. The cold was starting to seep into his bones, with his voice growing weaker. But the worst part? The rats. In the pitch black, they came. Drawn by the scent of food, they scuttled over his body, their tiny claws scraping against his skin. He couldn't move to swat them away. He could only lie there, helpless, as they gnawed at the scraps near his face. On day 14, a cave-in buried the passage leading to him. Rescuers couldn't even reach him anymore. For 3 more days, Floyd Collins lay alone in his tomb, slowly succumbing to starvation, dehydration, and the relentless cold. On February 16, 1925, after 17 days, Floyd Collins was officially declared dead. But the horror didn't end there. When rescuers finally dug through, they found his lifeless body, frozen in place, still trapped beneath the rock. And what happened next is one of the most grotesque twists in history. Rather than burying Floyd where he lay, they left his body in the cave. It wasn't until 2 years later that his family recovered the body and gave him a proper burial. But even then, the legend of Floyd Collins refused to rest. But before the end, he managed one last act, one final attempt to reach the world he would never see again. He left behind a message etched into the sand with trembling fingers, a final farewell to his family. The Sterkfontein Caves are ancient, a vast underground labyrinth in South Africa, a network of twisting tunnels and submerged passageways. Dangerous to even the most skilled cavers, they are as beautiful as they are deadly. In 1984, Peter Verholzel was one of the elite, a trained diver, someone who had spent years pushing the boundaries of human exploration. But even the most experienced explorers can make one fatal mistake. Peter's mistake was simple, but deadly. He dived without a guideline. It's a golden rule of cave diving: always secure a lifeline, a thin rope that leads back to the entrance. If you get disoriented, if silt blinds you, if panic sets in, the line is your only hope. But Peter, perhaps overconfident, perhaps just wanting to move quickly, ignored the rule, and the cave punished him for it. As Peter slowly descended into the darkness, the first thing he noticed was the coldness of the water, pressing against his wetsuit like an invisible vice. Peter exhaled slowly, watching the bubbles rise toward the dim light above before being swallowed by the dark. He slowly swam deeper, desperate to get to the site he had in mind. The tunnels twisted and split, forking into passageways that had never been fully mapped. His flashlight beam cut through the murky water, revealing the jagged walls and low ceilings that seemed to pulse with unseen movement. Then, something went wrong. He wasn't an amateur, and he knew to monitor his movements carefully to prevent disturbing the silt and blinding himself. But somewhere along the way, he must have taken a turn too quickly, and almost immediately, the movement kicked up a silt cloud, a blinding fog of debris that swallowed his vision. Maybe it was just a moment of hesitation, a second too long spent deciding which path to take. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Peter Verholzel was lost to the water. At first, he stayed calm. Training took over. He knew that in situations like this, the worst thing a diver could do was panic. He slowed his breathing, trying to conserve his oxygen. He turned in slow, careful circles, searching for something familiar. A passage, a rock formation, anything that could lead him back. Nothing. At this point, he would have relied on the guideline he had so confidently exempted from his routine. Every tunnel looked identical, the water so thick with darkness that it might as well have been the void of space. His heart pounded. The air in his tank was limited. He had minutes, maybe an hour at best, before he ran out. Then, his flashlight caught something above him, a break in the water, a pocket of air. With the last of his energy, he kicked upward, bursting through the surface. He gasped, filling his lungs with the damp, stale air of the cave. His hands gripped onto solid rock, and for the moment, he was alive. But his situation had only gotten worse. Peter found himself on a small, rocky ledge, barely big enough to sit on. The air pocket was just that, a bubble of trapped air, a cruel illusion of safety. Above him, nothing but stone. Below him, water leading back to the tunnels he was already lost in. There was no escape. His oxygen tank was empty now, useless. He pulled off his gear, laying it beside him, and tried to think. Someone would come looking for him. They had to. But how long would it take? The water was too deep, too dark, too unknown to risk diving again without direction. If he swam the wrong way, he would run out of breath and drown in complete darkness. His only choice was to stay. Wait. Survive. But as minutes passed, his body betrayed him. At first, it was just hunger and thirst. He had no food, only the droplets of mineral-rich cave water dripping from the ceiling. At first, they were a relief, but soon they became poison. Too much calcium, too many minerals, his stomach twisting in agony. Then came the weakness. Without food, his body ate itself. Muscles wasted away. His legs became useless. Then, the madness. Time had no meaning. The darkness seemed to stretch forever. He talked to himself, at first, whispering plans for how he would escape, then pleading for help that would never come. He saw shapes in the rock, heard voices in the stillness, and then his own reflection in the water. He barely recognized himself. His face was sunken, skeletal, his eyes like dark pits. It was then he knew this was where he would die. And so, with what little strength he had left, he reached down into the damp sand of the cave floor. And he left his last words, his final message to his family, his final attempt to prove he was still here, that he had fought until the very end. Then he lay down and waited, hoping for any rescue or help, but none came. When rescuers finally found him, weeks later, the scene was horrifying. His skeletal remains lay curled on the rock. His skin, once stretched over a strong diver's body, was now tight against his bones, and next to him was the message he had left for his family, carved with the last of his strength. The cave had taken him, just as it had taken so many before him. And his body? It was never removed. Even now, deep within the flooded tunnels of Sterkfontein, Peter Verhulzel remains, a silent warning and ghost of the depths. If you enjoyed this video on caving disasters, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more terrifying true stories. And if you want to hear about more chilling survival tales, let me know in the comments. What's the scariest caving disaster you've ever heard of? Until next time, stay safe, stay smart, and whatever you do, don't go in unprepared.